Good afternoon. The first item of business this afternoon is portfolio questions, and the first portfolio is rural affairs, land reform and islands. A reminder to members who wish to ask a supplementary question to press the request to speak buttons during the relevant question. And I call question number 1, Emma Roddick.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the Scottish Government in relation to its policies on land reform and land use, what discussions the Rural Affairs Secretary has had with ministerial colleagues regarding any action that can be taken to tackle land banking investment scams in the Highlands and Islands in light of the reported impact that such scams can have on the right of a community to have more of a say in how the land that they live on is used.
Cabinet Secretary Marie Gougeon.
There are complexities in responding to financial investment scams in Scotland, given that financial services and consumer redress and enforcement are reserved, and we need to actually understand the prevalence of these scams too. So where people have experienced them, we would advise them that they should contact Advice Direct Scotland for clear practical advice. But it might also be appropriate to report the issue to Police Scotland, where an assessment of any appropriate criminal enforcement action can be made. In circumstances where land banking investment scams threaten protected sites, such as sites of special scientific interest, appropriate enforcement action can be taken by relevant agencies. And what I would say on the wider point is that the Scottish Government is committed to ensuring that communities have a say in how their land and assets are used. And the Scottish Land Rights and Responsibilities Statement, as revised by the Scottish Government in 2022, set out that there should be meaningful collaboration and community engagement in decisions about land.
Emma Roddick.
I thank the Cabinet Secretary for that answer, and I think it will be appreciated by those who have been in touch with me when I do pass it on. My team has recently been dealing with multiple reports of land banking investment scams, including a number around the Spean Bridge area. These scams clearly have an impact on those who attempt to invest in the land, but they also have a detrimental effect on local communities and contribute to this sense that our land is something that can just be sold off in bits to the highest bidder. So in light of this, can I ask her what wider action has been taken to ensure that local communities and the natural environment are afforded greater protection from such scams? Cabinet Secretary.
First of all, I would just say that, of course, it is really concerning to hear about the prevalence of the scams that the member seems to be encountering across the region. And as I hope I've been able to outline in the initial response to Emma Roddick, we do recognise the serious impact that financial scams of any nature can have on people and the particular impacts that land banking investment scams can have on local communities. And I mentioned in my initial response about the appropriate avenues to try and seek advice in relation to that. I think in relation to the specific point that Emma Roddick raises and that specific example, there are a number of public bodies who are involved in responding to that, and parallel activities are being taken forward by Nature Scot, Police Scotland, Highland Council and Scottish Forestry to address this. And more broadly, I would say that, of course, the Government agrees that communities should be more involved in decisions that are made about land in their area, and that's why we have more options than ever before for communities to be able to take ownership of land and assets, and we're looking to improve on that and bring forward further measures in our land reform bill.
Okay, a couple of supplementaries. First, Rachel Hamilton.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. A forestry grant scheme developed by EJD Forestry has been proposed near Moorbattle in my constituency. The Community Cabinet Secretary are very concerned about their intention to use the land for carbon credits for corporate entity use. They're also concerned about visual impact, biodiversity loss and the lack of benefit to the community, including jobs. Cabinet Secretary, community views here are likely to be disregarded, as they are right across Scotland right now. Does the Cabinet Secretary agree with the SNP policy of right tree in right place, or is it yet another broken promise?
Cabinet Secretary.
I do agree with the right tree in the right place. In terms of that specific development that's on that Rachel Hamilton mentioned there, if she wants to follow up with me in more detail in relation to that so I can look into the specific point she's raised, I'm more than happy to do so. But there is normally a rigorous process that these applications go through, and I would expect there to be community engagement and community involvement as part of that, and that any potential developer would be taking very seriously the issues that have been raised. But again, if the member wants to follow up with me in writing, I'm more than happy to look at it.
And Rhoda Grant.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Do those scams not just highlight the need to ensure that landowners work in the public interest, and that there should be a test for those buying large tracts of Scottish land to make sure that they will act in the public interest so those scams can't take place?
The member, of course, raises a really important point that we covered in some detail when I was at the Net Zero Committee yesterday in response to the Stage 1 consideration of the Land Reform Bill, where we discussed a number of these issues. Because I do think that what comes with land ownership and land management does come that responsibility. Now, we have had interim standards in place in relation to the Land Rights and Responsibilities Statement. We are looking to build on that with the proposals in the bill, but of course we'll be considering all the evidence from Stage 1 to see how we can strengthen and how we can improve going forward.
Question 2 is not lodged. Question 3, Colin Smith.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the Scottish Government what progress it has made on annual reporting of its incentivisation of selective fishing gear and low-impact techniques that the Rural Affairs Secretary committed to commissioning in January 2023.
Cabinet Secretary.
No report has been completed to date, but that's due to delivering the necessary policy changes in how catch opportunities are distributed. So that has included the 2024 additional quota consultation, which increased catch opportunities for the non-sector fleet, vessels predominantly using more selective fishing gear or gear with reduced impacts on the seabed. And for 2025, we've introduced an initiative where vessels can apply for West of Scotland cod quota, and that seeks to incentivise the use of selective fishing gear and the use of fishing techniques in vessels that have a reduced impact on the environment.
Colin Smith.
Well, we haven't seen the report that the Cabinet Secretary committed to. I mean, the Government have had these powers for 5 years, and we're seeing the UK Government making far more progress in allocating all additional quota for a suite of stocks via their incentivisation scheme. So can the Cabinet Secretary tell us whether or not she will consider the UK Government's approach, and can she also commit to ensuring that all catches made by recipients of this bonus quota will be recorded and accounted for to allow an understanding of what is actually reducing bycatches and what is not, in line with the legal duties set out in the Fisheries Act and the National Marine Plan?
Cabinet Secretary.
I think in relation to the first couple of points that Colin Smith raises, I appreciate that you would be disappointed that that report hasn't been published yet, but I hope I've been able to outline that essentially what we have done is focus that resource to develop the policies that will ultimately do what that report would seek to evaluate. The member also touched on, in relation to some of the projects that I believe are happening in England at the moment. We're aware of one pilot in particular, which I think is taking part in Cornwall, which is about community quota management, and I think that that's taking advantage of the involvement of the Cornish Fish Producer Organisation, which has established quota management responsibilities. Now, there are various approaches that are happening elsewhere that I think we could potentially consider in Scotland, but we have to clarify the goals of what any type of pilot might be. But of course, anything we look to implement and the actions that we undertake now are of course in line with our responsibilities that are set out in the Fisheries Act.
Okay, again, a couple of brief supplementaries. First, Eleanor Whittam.
Encouraging innovation and incentivising specific techniques and gear requires investment. Based on the EMFF budget 2021 to 2027 and on Scotland's sea area, our funding share should have been circa £62 million per annum. Our fishers were shortchanged by the UK Tory government. Can I ask if the Cabinet Secretary has had any indication that the new UK government will rectify this situation, or is it going to be more of the same from lacklustre Labour for Scotland's fishers, i.e. no
Ms
positive
Whittam,
change?
if I could remind you that nicknames are not permitted in terms of the discourse in the Chamber. Cabinet Secretary.
I want to thank Eleanor Whittam for raising that really important point. Unfortunately, I can't offer that assurance that she's seeking that the Treasury are thinking again about this, despite numerous attempts for us to ask the UK Government to reconsider their allocation methodology more broadly, especially in relation to the recent announcements from the UK Government budget. But also when we look at our fisheries and marine funding at the moment, now previously we had that 7-year certainty. We received our fair share of the funding when we were members of the EU, but since we've left, we've received an annual allocation of £14 million for the Marine Fund Scotland. Now, if we were, and when you look at some of the other comparisons that I think are relevant here, the likes of Denmark, that is a smaller area, a smaller marine area, and if you're, when you look at the overall size of the country, receives £25 million equivalent. So I think we're not receiving our fair share, and we'll continue to press the UK Government for resolution.
Briefly, Tim Eagle.
Well, thank you very much. I think the thing I would disagree with slightly there is that the Scottish Government has made cuts itself within that budget. So we can talk about what comes from elsewhere, but it's also important about what you deliver here in Scotland. But it is an important question about selective fishing gear. What the Cabinet Secretary delivers in Scotland. This is an important question about selective fishing gears. Can I ask the Cabinet Secretary, what data do we collect in Scotland on the use of fishing gear, the right type of fishing gear and the techniques we use? And what further measures could she put in place, or the Cabinet Secretary, sorry, put in place to ensure that we are moving towards the most sustainable fisheries we can?
Yeah, as briefly as possible, Cabinet
I think I do have to address a really important point there, because Tim Eagle talks about cuts to the budget. However, we haven't cut. We've passed on in full our allocation from the UK Government, and again the £14 million which is part of the Marine Fund Scotland, and the Marine Directorate budget had an increase in its budget for the coming year, so I don't know where some of that is coming from. In relation to the other points that he mentions in relation to encouraging sustainable fishing and the use of gear, we look to incentivise that through our Marine Fund Scotland and support that work, but I'm more than happy to follow up in more detail with Tim Eagle as regards to the other specific points that he raises.
Thank you. Question 4 was withdrawn. Question 5, Kenneth Gibson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the Scottish Government, as part of the cross-government coordination on islands, including connectivity, what discussions the Rural Affairs Secretary has had with ministerial colleagues regarding support in the draft budget 25-26 to improve ferry services to Arran?
Cabinet Secretary Fiona Hislop.
I can reassure Mr Gibson that the Rural Affairs Secretary discusses these matters regularly with myself and colleagues. She is very aware that we intend to invest over £530 million in the coming year to support enhanced ferry services, including for Arran. I also want to make the Chamber aware today that work on the Drogheda Harbour business case has been expanded to explore alternative options, and I have instructed Transport Scotland and CMAL to progress discussions around potential purchase of a Drogheda Harbour by the Scottish Government. This would, of course, require a fair negotiated settlement and due diligence to be completed, but makes clear the Government's commitment to the future of a Drogheda Harbour. I can also confirm that funding for potential purchase of a Drogheda Harbour forms part of the 2025-2026 Scottish Government budget.
Kenneth Gibson.
I thank the Cabinet Secretary for that reply and warmly welcome confirmation that the Scottish Government is actively pursuing the purchase of Ardrossan Harbour. Many of the issues that have plagued progress on the redevelopment project stem from private ownership of the port, Brodick's redevelopment having been completed 7 years ago. The Cabinet Secretary is to be congratulated for breaking through the logjam to undo the damage caused by Tory privatisation. But can she say when a final agreement with Peel is likely to conclude and when we might finally see shovels in the ground at Ardrossan?
Cabinet Secretary.
The member might be aware and should be aware that obviously in terms of the ongoing negotiations, they are being conducted in good faith. I wouldn't want to say anything about timescales or indeed conclusions that would cause any issue with those ongoing negotiations. But I can assure you that I and the Scottish Government are committed to Ardrossan Harbour. I know that Kenny Gibson, as the constituency MSP, has been formidable in pressurising the Scottish Government to ensure that we can progress. I would have liked to have seen things happen, as everybody would like to have seen things happen sooner than they have done, and we are still obviously some way off in terms of what the investment results will provide and the timescale for that. But I can reassure him that that support and funding for the purchase is available in the 2025-26 budget.
Thank you. Again, 2 brief supplementaries. First, Jamie Green.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The Scottish Government's ears must have been burning this morning, because front page of the Ardrossan Saltcoats Herald is precisely this issue: missing, where is their ferry? Cabinet Secretary. It doesn't really matter who owns the port, because this government promised to upgrade it some 7 years ago. In fact, the former First Minister, Humza Yousaf, himself promised to upgrade it. So irrespective of those negotiations with Peel Ports, why doesn't the government just get on with what it promised? Secretary.
So clearly ownership of the port does matter. He'll be aware that it was his party that privatised ports some time ago. He will also be aware of subsidy control measures, again brought in by his government, that restricts the amount and the percentage of funds that are required. He will also know that the deterioration of that port will require additional funding than was originally proposed. The ongoing discussions are reaching, I hope, a conclusion that is sooner rather than later. I can't give a date from that, but I can reassure him, as I have always done as Minister and now Cabinet Secretary for Transport, that I have always treated this issue as a priority, and I think breaking a logjam that allows investment is something that I hope he will welcome and I hope he will vote for.
Okay, and briefly, Katie Clark.
I do welcome the Cabinet Secretary's announcement today. As she is well aware, it was agreed 7 years ago that Ardrossan would continue as the main port to Arran, and it has been clear for a number of years that Peel, the owners, seem to be the obstacle, and Labour in North Ayrshire have been calling for municipal ownership or a form of public ownership to break the logjam. Has she now come to the conclusion that it won't be possible to conclude a deal with Peel, the owners, or is that something that she is continuing to consider?
Cabinet Secretary.
I can reassure the member that discussions have been conducted in good faith. I think that's required. I think she might understand that you can only have discussions on purchase with the two willing partners, and I'm pleased that there is ongoing discussions in good faith, and that's something that I had asked my officials to initiate to ensure that we had a different option to one that was becoming increasingly complex and difficult for some of the legal reasons that I set out. So I'm pleased that we have the opportunity, should those be successful conclusions negotiated, to purchase the port, and as I've clearly set out, the funding for that is available in the 2025-26 budget, and I would encourage the member to support that.
Question 6, Craig Hoy.
To ask the Scottish Government how it plans to support the Scottish dairy sector.
Minister Jim Fairley.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The Scottish Government supports the Scottish dairy sector and Scottish agriculture and will continue to do so. Last year alone, we paid out £414.8 million through the BPS, Greening and Young Farmer schemes, with a total of just under £34 million in payments paid specifically to dairy farmers. We have also provided grant funding for the Dairy Growth Board to promote growth in the sector since its formation in 2014. That includes £85,000 of grant funding in this year. In addition, we continue to fund the Scottish Dairy Hub, including £50,000 this year, which offers free advice and information to Scotland's dairy farmers.
Craig Hoy.
The Minister is clearly not doing enough, because over the last decade, the Scottish milking herd has decreased by 24%, according to the Scottish Dairy Cattle Association. My own area of South Scotland saw the biggest decrease, with Ayrshire and then Dumfriesshire being the worst affected areas, with increased costs, more complex red tape and now a cruel family farm tax imposed by the UK Labour Government. How does the Government intend to further support dairy farmers, and will it look at helping to support new routes to market and increased domestic processing capacity to provide a long-term future for this vitally important sector?
Minister.
I would absolutely dispute the fact that the member makes that we're not doing enough, and I would also dispute the fact that the dairy and cow numbers have actually gone up last year. But in terms of the support the Scottish Government sets, the Scottish Dairy Growth Board was set up by Scottish ministers in support of the necessary coordination and collaboration required to implement the dairy sector growth strategy Ambition 2025. And there are a number of other issues that I won't take up time giving at the moment. I'm more than happy to write to the member to give him details of what those things are, but we are actively supporting the dairy sector in Scotland right now.
Please supplementary, Beatrice Wishart.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Shetland only has 2 dairy herds left that supply local milk. Additional milk supplies are imported, and when the ferry doesn't run, there's increased demand for local milk. So with fluctuating demand and given the challenges of the island dairy sector, how can the Scottish Government support dairy businesses to ensure that local milk will still be available?
Minister.
As I said to the previous member, there are a number of initiatives that the Scottish Government is taking in order to continue to support dairy production. I understand the particular difficulties that there are in Shetland, and again, I am more than happy to have the conversation with the member as to what more we can do to help them.
Question 7, Rose McCall.
Deputy Presiding Officer, to ask the Scottish Government whether it will provide an update on what action it can take to challenge the UK Government's inheritance tax changes for farmers.
Minister.
Again, thank you, Presiding Officer. We have raised this issue with the UK Government on a number of occasions, and most recently in a letter of the 6th of February to the Chief Secretary of the Treasury, and we will continue to engage with the UK Government on this issue. Our position remains that the changes to inheritance tax should be paused and an immediate review carried out. The UK Government must also urgently commit to undertake and publish full impact assessments on the impact that these changes are making in Scotland. The issue demonstrates yet again that inheritance tax would be far better to be devolved to the Parliament in Scotland.
Rose McCall.
I thank the Minister for that response. Farming families are not just in our rural communities, they are our rural communities. None no more so than in Mid-Scotland and Fife, where farms of all sizes contribute hugely to the economic stability and sustain communities the length and breadth of the region. A delegation from the NFU, TFA and the Country Land and Business Association met with the UK Government this week and described the response of ministers as deaf to what we're trying to say, and I think we all came out slightly boiling blood about it. So how can the Scottish Government get a different outcome to their negotiations? And does the Minister also believe that the UK Government is deaf to the concerns of our rural communities? Minister.
I absolutely agree with everything that Ros McCall has just said. And what we can continue to do is continue to put that pressure on. But the absolute best result that we could get is for Scotland to be an independent country, and we make those decisions right here in Scotland.
And briefly, George Adam.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Would we not be just as well to ask the Scottish Government to control the weather or the tide? Because is it not the case that taxation is clearly reserved to Westminster under Schedule 5 of the Scotland Act, a situation the SNP has sought to fix, while Labour and Tories have ignored it? Does the Minister agree with me that, given the facts, that this is just questioned as bad faith, especially when the unionist parties pretend to champion rural Scotland while Westminster neglects our farmers?
Briefly, Minister.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. We will take every opportunity that we can to challenge the UK Government's inheritance tax changes. We have consistently said that those further tax powers should be devolved to the Scottish Parliament, particularly when we have situations like this. But I absolutely agree with what the member says. Scotland should be an independent country. We can make those decisions here in this country.
Question 8, James Dornham, who joins us remotely.
To ask the Scottish Government how it is working to support Scotland's food and drink sector, both domestically and internationally.
Cabinet Secretary Mary Goodall.
Scotland's food and drink sector is a £15 billion industry which is revered not just at home but the world over. And just last week we sponsored the prestigious Michelin Awards in Glasgow, where Scotland was able to showcase the very best of the sector to an international audience at the Kelvingrove Art Gallery and Museum. Now, more generally, we've provided over £10 million between 2023 to 25 to support the delivery of Scotland's food and drink strategy, Sustaining Scotland, Supplying the World. And since 2014, we've provided over £7 million towards the Scotland Food and Drink Export Plan to help exploit the most significant opportunities for Scotland.
James Dornan.
Thank the Cabinet Secretary for that answer. According to January's trade modelling report, Scottish exports could be lower by 7.2% or £3 billion compared to continued EU membership, with the agri-food sector hardest hit. Scotland being dragged out of the EU against their will is not only an affront to democracy, but hugely damaging to the economy and jobs. Can I ask the Cabinet Secretary what data and modelling the Scottish Government possesses in the most recent impacts of Brexit and Labour's lack of urgency to make any effort to fix it on Scotland's food and drink sectors?
Cabinet Secretary.
We do continue to monitor and gather the data on this, and the food and drink sector has undoubtedly, as the member has outlined, borne the brunt of Brexit because it's disrupted our supply chains, created new trade barriers, and it's also driven up food prices, which we've all seen. Now, we also know that there has been that wider impact. When you look at the value of our food imports, as an example from the EU, that's fallen by 13% on 2019. And when we look at the particular sectors within that, our fruit and veg sector, fruit and vegetables will be down 51% and fish and seafood down 67%. And we've also seen the impact going the other way in relation to our exports, where we've seen a 45% fall in value of our fruit and veg exports between 2019 and 2023. But even with all that, though, we are continuing to do all we can to support our wider food and drink sector, because it is one of the industries that is such an important linchpin for our economy and will continue to do so into the future.
I'll take a couple of supplementaries, but they will need to be brief, so will the responses. Firstly, Finlay Carson.
Dairy is a major contributor to the food and drink industry. Dairy must not be compromised. It must be able to grow, deliver food security and net zero. Dumfries and Galloway holds an area which potentially has the biggest opportunity for dairy in the whole world with regards to net zero milk with no embedded water. So will the Minister, whatever the national park decision be, protect the South West dairy farming as a national asset?
Cabinet Secretary.
Absolutely. I would agree with the member on that as well. I think we're agreeing with the Tories probably on quite a number of points today, but I think especially in recognition of the fact that the importance of our dairy sector in the south of Scotland. Now, we recognise that. The member will be aware that in relation to the the National Park, there has been a consultation underway that closed on the 14th of February. We'll be analysing the results of that and looking at that quite closely. But I've always been keen, right from the start, to emphasise that if there was a proposal that was to go ahead, it has to recognise the very nature that is so unique to Galloway, which of course is so important for agriculture in our country. So I would just want to offer that assurance. We recognise the importance of our dairy sector, and particularly how important that is in the south of Scotland.
Thank you. We've strayed a little from the substantive question. See if we can get back there. Mercedes Villalba.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. According to Nature Scott, it's an objective of dairy management to provide a valuable and sustainable food source. So it's really welcome news that Ondura, Argyll and Bute Council have announced a new initiative to put wild venison on the school menu. But what action is the Scottish Government taking to normalise the consumption of venison in Scotland and to bring more of the culled deer to Scotland's food supply chain?
Briefly as possible, Cabinet Secretary.
Just to say, the member raises a really important point. The Minister is actively working on this because we know that we can do more. We have a venison strategy in place, and we're always looking to see how we can enhance and ensure that we have more domestic consumption of venison.
Thank you. That concludes portfolio question. Point of order, Rachel Hamilton.
Presiding Officer, I seek your advice. We all want to have factual and correct records on the official report. Jim Fairley stated that the Scottish dairy numbers have fallen, but my colleague, in good faith, said that over the last 10 years, the Scottish Dairy Cattle Association have said that they've fallen by 24%. Could I ask your advice that through the official report, the Minister could make reference to the figures that he's talking about so that we can all support the dairy industry?
Thank you, Ms Hamilton. I think you know that is not a point of order. You've made your point, but you've reduced the time that's available now for the next portfolio, which is health and social care. We'll have a brief pause to allow front benches to change first. And the next portfolio is health and social care. Again, remind members wishing to ask a supplementary question to press the request to speak buttons during the relevant questions. There is an awful lot of interest in such supplementary questions, so I will require brevity in both those and indeed the responses. I call question number 1, Megan Gallagher.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the Scottish Government what its response is to the recent programme Disclosure, Kids on the Psychiatric Ward, which features Sky House in NHS Greater Glasgow and Clyde.
Minister Marie Todd.
Firstly, I'd like to say that the care and treatment of the young people described in the programme is completely and wholly unacceptable. When our most vulnerable and unwell young people come forward and ask for help for their mental health, we owe them the highest standard of care and compassion. And the accounts given by those brave young people and their families were truly harrowing. We must do everything that we can to ensure that patients are treated with the care and respect that they deserve. NHS Greater Glasgow and Clyde has given assurance that the standards have improved significantly since the events described. They've initiated internal and external reviews to ensure the quality of care. At national level, I've asked Healthcare Improvement Scotland and the Mental Welfare Commission to conduct joint visits to all adolescent and child inpatient units to provide further assurance and to make recommendations for improvements and future scrutiny.
Megan Gallagher.
I've been working with a family over the last few months regarding their daughter, Harmony. The family told me their daughter was illegally sectioned and brought to Sky House on the 17th of October 2022. Harmony was given the wrong dosage of medication. She was restrained, taken from her family, who were managing her mental health concerns, and put into Sky House, where she was subjected to abuse and neglectful care. The abuse and cruelty shown in the documentary lays bare the institutional crisis at Sky House. Those young women were children who needed our care and support. Harmony's parents have not stopped fighting for their daughter, acting to correct her medical records and challenging those who have failed to care for her. They attempted to contact the Scottish Government several times to make them aware of what was happening at Sky House, and that includes the Cabinet Secretary, Neil Gray, and the Minister, Marie Todd. So my questions are, why has this Government ignored this family? And I'm looking at both the Cabinet Secretary and the Minister. Will the Cabinet Secretary respond to the letter that I sent, requesting to meet with the family? And will the Scottish Government step in to make sure that this abuse and neglect will never happen at one of these establishments ever again?
Minister.
So on all of those questions, I can give the member assurance that firstly, they will receive an answer to the latest request. The family have had numerous responses from government. The latest response is sitting on my desk, and I am content to release it as soon as possible after we speak. I am certainly content to meet with the family. The family will understand that it is very difficult for me to intervene in individual cases, but I think in this case it's very, very important that I meet with the family and hear their experience in order to shape improvements in the service going forward.
I've got a number of supplementaries. I will try to get them all in, but I will need to be spared some of the preamble and limit it to a question. Bill Kidd.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The experiences of the brave young people who told their stories in the disclosure programme must be taken seriously, and they should be commended for coming forward. Can the Cabinet Secretary or Minister advise what conversations are taking place between the Scottish Government, NHS Greater Glasgow and Clyde and the Scottish Mental Welfare Commission to ensure a thorough investigation of the incidents and provide reassurance and closure to young people and families affected?
Minister.
I thank the member for the question. Like everyone here, as I've said, I was absolutely shocked at what I saw in the programme. It was a difficult watch, and I want to put on record my sincere thanks to those young people and family members for having the courage to come forward. Since I've been made aware of the allegations in the programme, my officials have been in regular contact with NHS Greater Glasgow and Clyde to seek assurance about current practice in government. We have received answers to our questions and we welcome the reviews that they're taking forward. I'll obviously be monitoring the outcome of these reviews closely and, as the board would expect, holding them to account. To this end, myself and the Cabinet Secretary are going to meet with NHS Greater Glasgow and Clyde as soon as possible to seek direct assurance. We're also going to meet with NHS Lothian and NHS Tayside, who are hosts of the other two adolescent units in Scotland. As Minister, and if you'll indulge me, there is so much interest in this, I would like to say a little bit more. As Minister, I want to be assured that standards are high across all of our inpatient units. That's why I've asked Healthcare Improvement Scotland and the Mental Welfare Commission to carry out a series of joint visits to all of those adolescent inpatient units in Scotland, as well as the National Child Inpatient Unit. HIS and the Commission will use these visits to recommend what's required to ensure the quality and safety of our CAMHS inpatient units, both now and into the future.
Paul Sweeney.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. Stockwell Hospital has half of all child and adolescent mental health beds in the country. It is of a national importance, and I welcome the direct oversight that the Minister has indicated. In the documentary, serious allegations were made regarding the routine overuse of intramuscular injections as a way of managing at-risk children. In one case, a young person was restrained 27 times and forcibly injected 37 times in the space of just 1 month. Will the Minister investigate this specific allegation and establish how typical that sort of practice is?
Minister.
Absolutely. I give the member assurance that we will be looking at all of the issues that were raised in the programme and seeking reassurance that there is an improvement and the highest quality of practice is being conducted in our inpatient services.
Briefly, Alex Cole-Hamilton.
Thank you. I'm grateful for what the Minister says about oversight, but one of the most troubling revelations about the disclosure documentary was the fact that the Mental Welfare Commission had already visited Sky House no less than on 6 occasions, and 5 of those were announced visits. I think one of the aspects of concern to Parliament in this is the fact that the Mental Welfare Commission wasn't aware of its reach and clearly wasn't catching the behaviours that were revealed. What more can the government do to further empower the Mental Welfare Commission so that this kind of things can't happen again?
Minister.
Myself and the Cabinet Secretary are meeting with both of the organisations. I certainly am. We are keen to work with them to improve the quality of inspection and scrutiny. Of course, last year we had a review of inspection and scrutiny which gave us some indication of some of the improvements required within the whole of the mental health system. I will absolutely be focused on ensuring that the improvements in child and adolescent mental health, which are clearly needed, will be happening as a result of our interventions.
Question 2, Pauline McNeill.
To ask the Scottish Government how it plans to encourage the prescription of medical cannabis on the NHS for the relief of chronic pain.
Minister Jenny Minto.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Before I start, I'd like to recognise the work that Pauline McNeill has carried out in this area. There are no cannabis-based products for medicinal use licensed in the UK for the treatment of chronic pain, and any prescribing decisions would be for clinicians to make. The evidence base for cannabis-based products for medical use in the treatment of chronic pain is very limited, and combined with consistent evidence of adverse effects and/or harms. I remain very close to this area and continue to engage closely with UK Government ministers on the establishment of trials for cannabis-based products for medicinal use.
Pauline McNeill.
Certain cannabis medicines have in fact been legal since 2018, but Bergellite is not yet licensed. And Bergellite has been a lifesaver, particularly for children with severe types of epilepsy. But if Bergellite is not licensed, then of course the NHS won't fund it. But a small number of exceptions have been made in England and Northern Ireland for children with conditions in which Bergellite has been made available. In view of that, why then is cannabis medicines for complex epilepsy through the NHS impossible to organise in Scotland when it's clear that it has happened in other parts of the UK?
Minister.
I thank Pauline McNeill for her question and reference a very positive meeting that I had with her in her capacity as chair of the CPG, along with Tess White. Ms McNeill is correct. There are 3 cannabis-based products for medicinal use available on the NHS in Scotland to treat specific conditions. As a result of the meeting that I had with her and Ms White, we wrote to the UK Government to see if we could extend the trials. I've had a response back which I believe I have shared with Ms McNeill on that, but it is an area that I'm keeping a close eye on and will continue to have communications with our Chief Pharmacy Officer.
Question 3, Bob Doris.
To ask the Scottish Government what its position is on using the blood spot test given to newborn babies to screen for spinal muscular atrophy to support early diagnosis and effective treatment of babies born with the condition.
Mr Jenny Minto.
Thank you. Scotland's screening policy relies on recommendations made by the UK National Screening Committee, an independent scientific body that provides advice on screening policy for all 4 UK nations. To date, the National Screening Committee has not recommended spinal muscular atrophy or SMA screening through the existing blood spot test. However, I am aware that the committee is currently considering the matter, and I hope the member can rest assured that we are following developments closely, and we, along with the organisations responsible for screening, are already considering how to implement SMA screening as quickly and effectively as possible, should a recommendation be made.
Bob Doris.
I thank the Minister for that answer. Had my constituent baby Grace been screened for SMA at birth, early treatment would have been transformational. Delayed diagnosis and treatment drastically reduces the beneficial impact of treatment. Consequently, Grace will now have substantial lifelong care needs. It didn't have to be that way. The Cabinet Secretary previously told me the focus is to plan for SMA screening so that we can act when the time is right. Can I therefore ask the Minister, given the benefits of screening for SMA are both transformational and crystal clear, and it appears to be when and not if, despite the sluggish UK National Screening Committee, and I'm dissatisfied at their pace, when can we just get on screen for this and change the lives of babies like young Grace, my constituents?
Minister.
I thank Bob Doris for his question, and my heart goes out to baby Grace and her family and other families in a similar situation, and I absolutely understand the benefits of early diagnosis. I take on board the points that Mr Doris has made, and I know that he has met with the Cabinet Secretary, who would be happy, as would I, to meet with Bob Doris again. I am content to write to the NSC to understand the timeline for their decisions to be made, which I appreciate is of cold comfort to families that are already in this situation. I can confirm that all 4 UK Chief Medical Officers are aware of the NSC's plans and rationale for the review, and I re-emphasise again the fact that we are moving towards a way forward for implementation if the NSC results in that determination.
Very brief supplementary, Jackie Bailey.
I welcome the Minister's comments, but rather than following developments and asking for timelines, what engagement will ministers have with the UK National Screening Committee to ensure that SMA screening is actually agreed?
Minister.
I thank Jackie Bailey for her question, and that is an engagement that we are continuing to have both through the Cabinet Secretary and myself.
Thank you. Question 4, Mark Griffin, who joins us remotely.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the Scottish Government what the current average waiting times are for neurodevelopmental assessment and a speech and language therapy assessment for children and young people in NHS Lanarkshire and in Scotland as a whole.
Mr Marie Todd.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. We do not currently collect waiting times data for neurodevelopmental assessments or speech and language therapy. I recognise that neurodevelopmental assessment can be useful. However, our primary focus is on improving the support that's available for children and young people and their families. I expect NHS and Children's Services to work together to implement the 2021 neurodevelopmental specification standards, which align with GIRFIC. These highlight that support for children and young people should be made available on the basis of need, regardless of a formal diagnosis. Long waits for neurodevelopmental support are unacceptable.
Mark Griffin.
Thank the Minister for that answer, but I would urge the Minister to take a look at the waiting times. This time last year, the former First Minister told the Chamber that it would personally look into the case of Cody Morrow, a then 3-year-old from Bellshill who had spent his short life waiting for NHS assessment and treatment. Cody is now 4 and he's a year into his now 4-year wait for a neurological development assessment. His mum is physically and mentally exhausted. She doesn't know where to turn. So can the Minister say why 4-year-old Cody needs to wait just for the assessment, not even to begin treatment until he's 7?
Minister.
So I absolutely appreciate the value of assessment, and that's an area that we are keen to explore further as part of the system improvement. But many children and young people who present looking for assessment don't meet diagnostic criteria for a neurodevelopmental condition, but they would still benefit from support. Also, their needs change over time. In line with GIRFIC, we therefore believe that the focus should be on identifying needs and ensuring that children, young people and their families receive the support and the appropriate adjustments that they require.
And briefly, Jackie Dunbar.
Presiding Officer, it is vital that every child has the best possible start in life and that any developmental concerns are identified early. Can the Minister outline what steps the Scottish Government are taking to support families and young people to ensure that assessment times are reduced?
Minister.
I agree with my colleague that it's absolutely vital that children receive support for any neurodevelopmental concerns as soon as possible. That's why our National Neurodevelopmental Specification places an expectation on NHS and Children's Services to work together to provide the support required by children and families at the point at which they need it and not dependent on a formal diagnosis. This support might include assessment, diagnosis or other interventions.
Question 5, Annabel Ewing.
Presiding Officer, to ask the Scottish Government when it last met with the Director of the Fife Health and Social Care Partnership and what was discussed.
Cabinet Secretary Neil Gray.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Ministers and officials regularly meet with representatives from health and social care partnerships, including Fife. I met Lynn Garvey, Fife's Director of Health and Social Care, this morning when I visited the Queen Margaret Hospital in Dunfermline to see their frontline discharge to assess work, which has been supported by the British Red Cross.
Annabel Ewing.
I thank the Cabinet Secretary for his response. He will be aware that I have already written to him on the serious matters arising in the Sandy Peggy case, and I await his detailed response. What I would wish to ask this afternoon, Presiding Officer, concerns another serious matter, which is, given the projected overspend on the part of Fife Health and Social Care Partnership of at least £34.8 million, with significant cuts to vital services planned, is the Cabinet Secretary confident that internal control systems in the Health and Social Care Partnership and in NHS Fife are in fact robust and reliable, and if so, on what basis? And where does he expect NHS Fife to find the £21 million or so to bail out the Health and Social Care Partnership, given that NHS Fife itself is reportedly in the red to the tune of £55 million.
Cabinet Secretary.
Presiding Officer, I thank Annabel Ewing for her question. I'm aware of a recovery plan that has been agreed by the partnership and understand an agreement may be implemented requiring remaining overspend to be funded by NHS Fife and Fife Council. The Scottish Government regularly meets with NHS Fife to discuss the board's financial performance, including monthly conversations to discuss forecasts and risks. NHS Fife has outlined their continued efforts to deliver recurrent savings and to work in collaboration with their partnerships to reduce projected overspend, and I will be meeting with the leader of Fife Council and the chair of Fife IJB to discuss pressures, good practice and transformational change.
Thank you. I've got a number of supplementaries. I'll try to get as many of them in as possible. It would be helpful if they were as brief as possible. I start with Murdo Fraser.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. When the Cabinet Secretary is meeting Fife Health and Social Care Partnership, will he be asking them to assure him that they are complying with the law in relation to the provision of single-sex facilities for their female members of staff?
Cabinet Secretary.
I obviously expect all public bodies to comply with the law to ensure that the rights of all their staff members are being complied with.
Rose McCall.
Thank you. And the Cabinet Secretary will be aware, as just mentioned, of the cuts to services by Fife Health and Social Care Partnership, partially funded by NHS Fife. And given NHS Fife are spending astronomical sums of money on a dismissal case for staff who raise concerns about their basic rights to a single-sex changing facility, what will the Cabinet Secretary do to ensure that financial mismanagement doesn't affect the care for residents in Fife?
Cabinet Secretary.
Clearly, we work with both NHS Fife and Health and Social Care Partnerships, as we do health boards across the country, to make sure that the resource that we are committing, £21.7 billion in the budget for next year, is to address the issues that we're facing within the health service and to see improvements coming forward as a result. And I expect all boards to come forward with plans to that regard.
Douglas Ross.
Presiding Officer, this morning the Cabinet Secretary said he couldn't comment on the Sandy Peggy case because it's a live employment tribunal, but then he went on in the same interview to give full confidence in the board of NHS Fife, who are the other party in the employment tribunal. So can Neil Gray tell us why he's backing the bureaucrats on the board and not a nurse with 30 years service to the NHS?
Cabinet Secretary.
I'm not going to provide any further comment to a live tribunal process, and I think it's important that we support the work of NHS Fife delivering for the citizens of Fife in improving their health and social care services.
Care.
Cabinet Secretary has a legal duty to uphold the provisions of the Equality Act in 2010, and in June 2024 he received a letter from Sandy Peggy's solicitor, Ms Gribben, highlighting issues in connection with her case. The Cabinet Secretary, I repeat, has a legal duty to uphold these protections. Did he challenge NHS Fife's actions and seek assurances of full compliance with the law at any time?
Cabinet Secretary.
The correspondence that Stephen Kerr refers to was responded to by officials and gave guidance as to the measures that could be taken. I'm not going to comment further on a live tribunal case. I think it's important that process is allowed to conclude to allow for the due process to continue and to conclude in that process.
And briefly, Fergus Ewing.
Presiding Officer, when will the Scottish Government bring forward a full debate on the issue of the provision of safe spaces for women, especially those who require to disrobe in connection with their work, such as health employees?
Cabinet Secretary.
I've already set out that I expect all public bodies, including health boards, to comply with legislation and the guidance that's in place to ensure that all employees are able to safely go about their work and to do so in a way that meets their needs.
Question 6, Claire Adamson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the Scottish Government how it is supporting frontline staff at University Hospital Wishaw.
Cabinet Secretary.
The Scottish Government are supporting frontline staff throughout the health service through funding of over £2.5 million annually to support frontline staff wellbeing. This funding provides our workforce with access to psychological interventions and therapies, self-service resources through the National Wellbeing Hub and the National Wellbeing Helpline delivered by NHS 24. Registered staff also have access to confidential mental health services through the Workforce Specialist Service. In addition, addition, the National Wellbeing Hub offers a range of self-care wellbeing resources and signposting to relevant mental health and support services. We're aware of the challenges that frontline staff are experiencing and will continue collaborating with leaders and staff in health and social care and social work to identify and address areas of stress and to explore additional actions to support staff.
Claire Adamson.
Thank the Minister for his answer. I have been helping constituents who have faced significant delays when transported by ambulance to University Hospital Wishaw. In one case, a patient was waiting outside the hospital for 7 hours, but the consultant and specialist that they were due to see was actually at Monkland Hospital that evening. While I recognise immense pressure and pay tribute to our health workers, can the Cabinet Secretary confirm that ambulance dispatches are coordinating with local Lanarkshire hospitals to avoid unnecessary delays? And will the Scottish Government work with NHS Lanarkshire to review coordination between services to ensure that patients are delivered to hospitals on a capacity basis as the first instance?
Cabinet Secretary.
I'm sorry to hear the experience of Claire Adamson's constituent. The Scottish Ambulance Service works closely with boards to ensure patients are transported to the appropriate hospital for their needs. Hospital ambulance liaison officers are instrumental in helping the flow of patients in hospital and minimising the impact of handover delays. And while we recognise that some patients will need ambulances for patient transport for clinical reasons, we are considering other solutions, including working with community transport providers and initiatives such as Call Before You Convey to ensure the ambulance service responds to those with the greatest clinical need and minimises delay at A&E.
Question 7 not lodged. Question 8, Fulton McGregor.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the Scottish Government whether it will provide an update on the action that it is taking to support people with long COVID.
Minister Jenny Minto.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The 2025-26 budget includes new investment of £4.5 million to deliver new specialist support across the country for long COVID, ME, chronic fatigue and other similar conditions. In addition, we commissioned NHS National Services Scotland to operate a long COVID strategic network, which is currently delivering a programme of virtual educational sessions targeted at GPs working in Scotland. These will look at topics including speech and language issues and vocational rehabilitation.
Fulton McGregor.
Minister, for that answer. The Minister, I know, is aware of my constituent Tracy McMillan and the healthcare support provided to her son Jonathan, who is suffering from long COVID. And I do want to thank the Minister for a recent response to my letter. However, I am advised by Mrs McMillan that there have been no major improvements in Jonathan's case, and persistent symptoms continue to significantly affect both him and his family. The £4.5 million contained in the draft budget for specialist support for long COVID is very much welcome. But I do wonder if the Minister can outline how she thinks that may be used by health boards to bring tangible benefits to Jonathan and others in his situation.
Minister.
Fulton McGregor for his question, and I am very sorry to hear of the difficulties that continue to be experienced by Jonathan and his family, and absolutely recognise the role that Mr McGregor has played in advocating on their behalf. I think one of the key things is listening to those that are living with these conditions, and that's something that my officials are doing as the work that is ongoing to determine how the additional £4.5 million announced in the draft budget to deliver new specialist support services across the country for long COVID, ME, chronic fatigue and other similar conditions will be allocated. Of course, allocation of this resource is subject to the passage of the budget bill, and we continue to ask Parliament to unite behind the budget to ensure this funding reaches the people who need it most.
Thank you. I appreciate there's a lot of interest in supplementaries. Unfortunately, we are already beyond time. We do need to move on to the next item of business. That concludes portfolio questions. There will be a brief pause before we move to the next item of business to allow front benches to change.